Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Cool, man. So, what are some of the things, I guess I'll kick it off with my first thing I'd really like to discuss, because I mean, it's something of a mystery to myself as well, is when the war happened, when the invasion happened in Ukraine, I was one of those people thought, man, this thing's going to be over in 72 hours. The Russian bear is just going to crush these poor people. Instead, something very different happened. And one of the enduring questions, something that I think is going to be studied for a long time, is where was the Russian Air Force?
Honestly, it's a great question. And I think the answer is really sort of a multitude of answers. But some of the biggest problems that the Russian Air Force ran into, first and foremost, was that their goal was to very quickly sort of take Kyiv, replace the Ukrainian government, and act as though they were the liberators. The Russian Air Force, however, has a real lack in not only precision-guided ordnance, but in training to use that precision-guided ordnance. So Russia may have the second largest Air Force in the world, technically third behind the US Navy after the US Air Force. But most of their equipment is set up for sort of carpet bombing or not really targeted bombing activities. So because Russia didn't want to lay waste to Ukraine, it didn't play into that narrative of them as the liberators, they had to really limit how they used it. But some of the other problems kind of coming into play are Russia's real inability to perform complex air operations in a contested environment. Friendly fire is a very real threat for Russian air forces, and that includes with their S-300 and S-400 Triumph air defense systems we always hear are so great. They don't seem to actually be all that great, especially when it comes to figuring out who's the friendly and who's the enemy target when everybody's flying pretty similar aircraft.
Don't we run?
I think one of the biggest things that screwed Russia here is really their combat doctrine. If you read Russia's approach to combat, they sort of assume that NATO is going to gain air superiority in a war between Russia and NATO. So their doctrine has sort of shifted to assume that they will not have air dominance. And because of that, they didn't really place a huge emphasis on SEAD or suppression of enemy air defenses. They didn't try to take Ukraine's airspace and hold it. We kept asking, when are they going to do it? Are they even able to? It seems as though they didn't actually think it was that important, at least according to their doctrine. They're learning the hard way that it very much is. So I think it's a combination of a lack of training, a lack of ability to sort of figure out who's friendly and who's enemy in complex airspace, and also just a lack of precision-guided ordnance. So all they really could do is come bomb tons of stuff or not bomb much at all. And they opted for not bomb much at all in the initial stages of the war, at least.
So like in Syria, a lot of what we saw was the Russian fighter jets flying in onesies and twosies and then just sort of dropping dumb bombs over a city.
That's exactly what you'll see. Yeah, and you'll still see that now. Russia really does not fly large sorties of aircraft. You saw when the Gulf War kicked off, we had literally 1,500 plus aircraft in the air at the same time, all operating in the same airspace. It was a ballet of coordination between refuelers, AWACS, actual tactical aircraft, bombing missions, and support for those bombers, all at the same time. Russia does not seem to have that capability. Again, in large part because they have a lot of trouble discerning between friendly and enemy targets in the air.
Don't the Russians have, I mean, this is an assumption, but we use these IFF systems to sort of deconflict that, right? Do the Russians not use those types of those types of safeguards?
They use the same systems, or at least a similar type of system. You'd think that it would work effectively, but they also tend to turn them off. They turn their transponders off just like we do when we're trying to be stealthier. It does not seem, either because of a lack of training or because of technical deficiencies, that they're able to accurately discern between friendly and enemy aircraft once things get hot and heavy. That might not be a technical limitation. It really could be genuinely just a lack of training, particularly among their pilots, just because economically, Russia has a lot of trouble getting their pilots in the seat for as many hours as they need to really be good at using some of their more advanced systems. That's why they're relying on their older tech, even though they do have some newer weapons that they haven't leveraged as much.
That was actually the next thing I wanted to ask you, because we've had a few pilots on the show before, and when they talk about how they are trained, American fighter pilots, I mean, it sounds like we drill them pretty relentlessly. And then afterwards, they do extensive AARs on them. Like he was saying, one guy we talked to was talking about how they would do a training exercise with the French fighter pilots. And then when they come back and do the AAR, the French pilots got up and walked out because they couldn't handle being interrogated and having their deficiencies noted. They were like, we're out of here. Fuck you guys. You can't say that to me. So, I mean, the way we train American pilots is pretty relentless and pretty ruthless from what it sounds like. Could you kind of break down?
100% right.
Could you kind of break that down? I mean, how American fighter pilots are trained versus how Russian fighter pilots are trained?
Absolutely. The first thing that you need to know is that even with stealth aircraft, we tend to think that stealth can defeat detection. Really, stealth aircraft delay detection, but especially when we're talking about stealth fighters tend to operate in battle space where the enemy knows you're there. Lower frequency radar bands, X and Y bands, can really detect stealth fighters. They just can't get a weapons grade lock on them. Flying wings like the B-2 can actually defeat that type of radar, but the F-35 and the F-22 can't. So even when we're planning sorties for stealth platforms like the F-22, a huge part of mission success is that planning stage in the beginning, where you're trying to identify where the air defense systems that might cause you trouble are, and you're planning a route around them and things like that. Once we have a thing a lot of fighter pilots call the good idea cutoff line in that planning stage, which is we're throwing all the ideas out. I say I'm not a fighter pilot, but we're throwing all the ideas out on the table that we possibly can that could feasibly work. Once you get to a certain point, though, there's no more good ideas. Now we're going to execute with what we have, and we need to find a way to make it work the best that we can. Once you go and complete the mission, that AAR, the after action report, is something that American fighter pilots put a lot more emphasis on than you'll find even with some of our NATO partners. Justin Hazard Lee is an F-35 pilot with the U.S. Air Force. He's got a YouTube channel called Hazard Lee, definitely worth checking out. But he's a good buddy of mine, and he often talks about how fighter pilots have to own their mistakes, and you usually need to be the guy to kind of present it to the room. If you've seen Top Gun recently, Maverick threw a hissy fit because his girlfriend said that he made a bad move in a dogfight. That is not at all how it works in real life. Your job is to go back and pick apart what it is that you did and what your peers did so that next time you can do it better. Ultimately, the goal isn't just mission accomplishment, it's surviving. And your ego can get in the way of surviving. And some fighter pilots have trouble with dealing with that. The US is pretty hardcore about it. And I think that that's part of why modern fighter pilots and Navy aviators, they tend not to live up to kind of that maverick ego stereotype that we tend to think. Because in the 80s and the 70s, they really did. But nowadays, you kind of have to eat humble pie pretty regularly as a combat aviator. And I think it rounds off the edges and it makes them nicer guys.
It's definitely, I think it's true of the United States military. I wouldn't say quite across the board, but to a large extent. We talk more about special operations guys here. I mean, after a mission, the same thing. We'll do pretty extensive AARs and being self-critical and pointing out the mistakes that got made so that we don't hopefully do them again.
Honestly, I've learned that from working with you and guys like you. The special operations community, there are definitely some guys out there where humble isn't in their vocabulary. But for the most part, they're pretty unassuming guys. You could go to a lot of barbecues with Green Berets or Rangers and not know that they were Green Berets or Rangers, until maybe it comes up later.
I feel like, part of this entire conflict in Ukraine is sort of like American Armed Forces appreciation moment, because as a journalist, I look at all the things that we fuck up, and having been in the military myself, I know about a lot of the things we fuck up. But as bad as we are sometimes, it's like, wow, that's really bad.
the best thing that could have happened to the U.S. military as of late, especially just politically, it's a difficult environment. The military's been politicized more and more as of late. And not to mention, in the United States, we just really like to complain about things. It's like one of our favorite pastimes. I definitely think it surpasses baseball. But then you get to go see a country like Russia absolutely fumble an invasion of a country like Ukraine that really should not have posed that significant a threat to them. I mean, Ukraine should have been a speed bump. I think just a couple of years ago, there were some analysts saying that if Russia decided to take Europe, they could take all of Europe in the first 6 days. They couldn't even take Ukraine.
Right.
You know, I think that this is a great example of Russia's intelligence apparatus, you know, certainly feeding Putin some bad information, but also Russia's been feeding the world this line of bullshit about their military capability for so long that it started to really seep in systemically, and they're starting to buy their own hype. Obviously, that problem's been solved now. But I really do think that even among the Russians, a lot of them thought they were just going to steamroll through. I published an article the day before the invasion called How Russia Uses the Media to something about hyping up their military, to give us this false sense of military might. And then when the invasion started, I panicked because I was like, Ukraine is not a very formidable threat. Russia's going to steamroll them, and it's going to make me look like an asshole. Right. Just because I was saying Russia isn't really a peer-level opponent for the United States or even for China. I did not imagine that Russia would make me look this smart.
Right, right.
They really did fumble.
Well, right. I mean, Alex, if it makes you feel any better, like I spoke to in some cases, some preeminent experts on the Russian military, and none of them thought it would go down like this either.
And it's honest, it's incredible. I think the biggest mistake, in my opinion, being an AirPower guy, maybe it's a bias, but just Russia's military doctrine, assuming that they can't control the skies, so they didn't even make an effort to do it, has really, really been maybe not the biggest problem. I'd argue maybe at least one of the biggest problems. Yeah. A lack of command and control and a lack of coordination.
Well,
and logistics.
I mean, from an American point of view, like our first thing we're going to do is maintain or gain air superiority. I mean, we're not even really, I don't think, apt to conduct ground operations until we control the skies overhead.
No, you're absolutely right. I was reading an article from Air Force Magazine. It's a few years old now, just recently, but it was basically breaking down American military doctrine and how air power is intrinsic to every step of American military doctrine. And it's probably the most important in the first 2 or 3 steps, where you're right. It's all about controlling the skies, not only for close air support, but for logistics, for command and control. People don't realize things like air defense systems are not just a radar array with some missiles bolted to it. An air defense system can only have reach beyond line of sight, beyond the horizon, if it's bolstered by airborne AWACS. AWACS are huge targets. You need to control the airspace in order to have effective air defenses. You can't control the airspace unless you're trained for suppression of enemy air defenses, which Russia, this is another important point. In America, we use aircraft called Wild Weasels. Now they're specially modified F-16s. In the past, they've been F-4 Phantoms and other types of aircraft. But they're really, we cover them in radar absorbent materials. We arm them with the AGM-88 HARM missiles. They're anti-radiation radar hunting missiles. And we send them into contested airspace to get lit up by enemy air defenses. The goal is to destroy the air defenses before they get a chance to destroy you. Just by being present, you can suppress those air defenses because they may shut down to avoid being attacked by a HARM missile. Russia does have anti-radiation missiles, but they have no dedicated SEAD platform like an American Wild Weasel. They just don't seem to think it's that important. Things like that are just mind-blowing to us here in the West, especially in the United States, where the number one priority is to control the airspace before you do anything else. I mean, a perfect example of that is if you are being engaged by a sniper and you don't have armor nearby, your best solution is an airstrike. There's no reason for us to just feed bodies into the wood churner to go try to take the sniper out. Russia does it the other way. They will just keep throwing bodies at the sniper until they get them. It does not make sense in 21st century warfare.